"Touch me not, Terran," hissed the Azure Empress, her voice barely audible through blood-flecked lips. "You are forbidden." Smoke billowed across the desolation of Karvosh Valley, once a verdant paradise now transformed into an apocalyptic tableau of destruction. The acrid stench of burning synth steel mingled with the coppery tang of blood, both crimson and cobalt, that soaked the scorched earth. Empress Nilara Zin'Vex lay sprawled among debris, her once magnificent form reduced to a broken figure against the wasteland. Her elegant limbs, known throughout the Azuran Empire for their graceful power, now twisted at grotesque angles that spoke of grievous injury. The royal azure skin, normally luminescent with bioluminescent patterns that reflected her moods and status, now appeared dull and patched with dirt. Streaks of indigo fluid, her lifeblood, trickled from multiple wounds across her body. Each labored breath sent spasms of pain through her shattered ribcage, a grim reminder of how far she had fallen in mere hours. Nilara's opalescent eyes, famous for their penetrating intensity that could make hardened warriors flinch, now flickered weakly as she surveyed what remained of her once proud battle force. The Azuran Legion, feared across 3 galactic quadrants, had crumbled under the relentless assault of the Vrekari Dominion. One by one, her elite guards had fallen or fled, their legendary loyalty evaporating when faced with certain annihilation. The eerie quiet that followed the battle felt more oppressive than the thunderous explosions that had preceded it. In the distance, sporadic bursts of energy weapons still illuminated the horizon. But here, in this forgotten corner of devastation, Nilara was utterly alone. She attempted to rise, a reflexive assertion of the imperial dignity ingrained through centuries of rule, but her body betrayed her. Muscles screamed in rebellion. Internal injuries sent lightning bolts of agony through her nervous system, and she collapsed back onto the blood-soaked ground. The movement dislodged her ceremonial headdress, the crown of Azuran, which tumbled to the dirt beside her. Its gleaming crystals, once pulsing with the collective consciousness of her ancestors, now lay dormant and lifeless. Yet despite this absolute defeat, something unyielding remained in Nilara's gaze. Beyond mere survival instinct lurked a deeper resolve, the ancient pride of a lineage that stretched back millennia, an unspoken vow that as long as she drew breath, the empire would not truly fall. As minutes stretched to hours, that resolve began to waver. No rescue materialized from the scattered remnants of her fleet. The communication implant embedded in her wrist remained silent, its quantum connection severed. The bitter taste of abandonment flooded her mouth, more caustic than the blood she occasionally coughed up. "Is this how 9 centuries of Zin'Vex rule concludes?" she whispered to the indifferent sky. "Not with glorious transcendence, but alone on a forgotten battlefield?" Nilara forced her breathing to steady, summoning what remained of her dignity. If death sought her today, she would meet it as befitted an Empress of Azeron, with unflinching eyes and unwavering composure. Yet beneath the imperial facade, beneath layers of pride and stoicism, a small voice persisted. Perhaps fate had not finished with her yet. Perhaps something unexpected would materialize to alter this seemingly inevitable conclusion. Through swirling smoke and ash, a figure materialized like a specter from ancient mythology. His movements were measured and deliberate, boots making barely a sound against the debris-strewn ground. Human, unmistakably so, though calling him ordinary would be a grave disservice. His weathered face told stories of countless conflicts across disparate worlds. Eyes that had witnessed too much death remained alert, scanning the surroundings with practiced efficiency. He wore combat armor that bore no insignia, no allegiance to any recognized military force, a freelancer perhaps, or a deserter who had found his own path through the chaos of interstellar war. The weapons holstered at his sides showed signs of extensive use, but impeccable maintenance. This was a man who survived by skill rather than luck. Garrett Wolfe halted when he spotted her among the wreckage. Initially, she appeared to be just another casualty among thousands, but something drew him closer, an unconscious recognition of significance, perhaps. As he approached, he noticed the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the occasional twitch of her elongated fingers. Alive, if barely. Up close, her alien nature became strikingly apparent. The azure skin with its faint luminescent patterns, the elongated limbs that suggested both predatory speed and royal grace, the delicate facial structure that somehow conveyed both fragility and imperious strength. Most arresting were her eyes, opalescent orbs that even clouded with pain contained something ancient and powerful. For a moment Garrett hesitated. Every instinct honed through years of combat urged caution. This wasn't his fight. She wasn't his kind. Helping her could invite complications he couldn't afford, or worse, retribution from whichever force had left her in this condition. Yet as he observed her more closely, he noticed how her fingers stretched slightly outward, an unconscious gesture that seemed almost like reaching. Something shifted in his perception. A recognition of another being fighting for survival against impossible odds. He had seen too much death, participated in too much destruction. Perhaps this once he could choose differently. Kneeling beside her, Garrett assessed her injuries with the practiced eye of someone who had patched up countless battlefield wounds, both his own and others. The damage was extensive, multiple lacerations that oozed indigo fluid, limbs at unnatural angles suggesting compound fractures, chest rising unevenly in a way that indicated pulmonary damage. "You need medical attention," he muttered, more to himself than to her, as he reached for the field med kit secured at his belt. "You are forbidden to touch me," she rasped suddenly, startling him with both the strength and authority her weakened voice somehow conveyed. "Taryn." Garrett froze, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder. He met her gaze steadily, neither intimidated nor deterred. In her eyes he recognized fear masked by defiance, vulnerability concealed beneath imperial command. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of proud warriors facing their mortality, in commanders watching their strategies crumble. "Look," he said finally, his voice firm but not unkind. "I understand pride. I respect boundaries. But you're bleeding out, and I have supplies that might keep you alive. Your choice, dignity or survival." Her iridescent eyes narrowed slightly, studying him with an intensity that seemed to peer beyond mere physical appearance. For several heartbeats, neither spoke, the unspoken conflict between them as palpable as the smoke hanging in the air. Then, almost imperceptibly, she closed her eyes and tilted her head in what he interpreted as reluctant assent. With careful precision, Garrett began treating her wounds, applying pressure to the most severe bleeding, administering nanite-infused coagulants from his medkit. His movements were methodical but gentle, mindful of causing additional pain. As he worked, he noticed intricate patterns etched into her azure skin. Not mere decorations, but a complex language of symbols that seemed to tell a story of lineage and power. "Why?" she asked suddenly, her voice stronger, but strained with both pain and confusion. "This conflict is not yours. I am not your ally. What do you seek to gain, Taryn?" Garrett paused, considering her question with the seriousness it deserved. It wasn't the first time he'd been asked to justify an act of mercy in a merciless universe. "Maybe I've seen enough death," he answered honestly. "Maybe I'm tired of watching worlds burn and species exterminate each other over territory or ideology or resources that will mean nothing in 1,000 years. He applied a synthetic skin patch to a particularly deep wound on her abdomen. "Or maybe I'm just contrary enough to save someone when everyone else decided they should die." Nilara studied his face, searching for deception but finding only weary determination. "Humans," she murmured, a complex mixture of disdain and bewilderment coloring her tone. "You are paradoxical creatures. You wage war with unmatched savagery, yet demonstrate compassion that defies evolutionary logic." "We contain multitudes," Garrett replied with a grim smile. "Just like your people, I'd wager." Her expression hardened. "You know nothing of my people." "I know they left you here to die," he countered, meeting her gaze directly. "That tells me something." The truth of his words struck her like a physical blow. She turned away, unwilling to let him witness the raw emotion that threatened to breach her carefully maintained composure. For centuries she had ruled through a combination of awe and fear, demanding absolute loyalty without offering trust in return. Now abandoned and broken, the consequences of that approach lay bare before her. "They followed me because they feared me," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Not because they loved me. And now..." she trailed off, the unspoken conclusion hanging between them. Garrett frowned, his hands momentarily stilling their work. Fear can control soldiers for a while, he observed quietly, but it doesn't inspire them to sacrifice. It doesn't make them stand their ground when everything's falling apart. He resumed bandaging a wound on her shoulder. Maybe that's why they ran. Maybe they never believed in you, just feared what would happen if they didn't obey. Nilara's jaw tightened, her opalescent eyes flashing with momentary anger at his presumption. Yet she couldn't dismiss his words. They aligned too perfectly with the doubts that had begun to gnaw at her consciousness. Had she mistaken obedience for loyalty? Had her reign, for all its expansion and glory, been built on foundations of sand rather than stone? "What would you have me do?" she asked, unexpected vulnerability threading through her imperial tone. "Abandon centuries of tradition? Pretend affection for beings who exist to serve the Empire's purpose?" "No," Garrett replied firmly, "but maybe start questioning why they abandoned you when things got tough. Maybe stop blaming them and start asking what kind of leader inspires people to stand and fight even when defeat seems certain." His blunt assessment struck deeper than any physical wound. For a moment neither spoke, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a blade. Then almost imperceptibly, Nilara nodded. Not in agreement perhaps, but in acknowledgement that his words contained a truth she needed to examine. As Garrett finished treating the worst of her injuries, a fragile understanding began to form between them. Trust remained distant, but mutual respect had taken root, a tentative bridge across the vast divide of species and circumstance. "Can you walk?" he asked, surveying her splinted limbs with professional concern. Nilara attempted to rise, gritting her teeth against the searing pain. Her legs buckled immediately, forcing her to acknowledge a humiliating truth. "Not yet," she admitted reluctantly. Garrett nodded, already calculating their limited options. "Then I'll carry you. We need to find shelter before nightfall. This battlefield will draw scavengers, both mechanical and biological." Before she could protest, he carefully lifted her into his arms, mindful of her injuries. Nilara stiffened at the contact, centuries of imperial protocol screaming against such familiarity from a lower species. Yet necessity overrode tradition, and she found herself reluctantly accepting his assistance. "My crown," she said suddenly, gesturing weakly toward the ornate headdress lying forgotten in the dirt. "I cannot leave it." Garrett hesitated, then carefully retrieved the artifact, securing it to his belt. "Priorities," he murmured. "First survival, then regain your crown, both literally and figuratively." As they left the battlefield behind, Nilara found herself facing an uncertain future for the first time in her centuries-long existence. Her empire might be crumbling, her authority in tatters, but something new and undefined had begun to take shape, a possibility born from the unlikeliest of alliances. The journey ahead would test them both in ways neither could anticipate. The relentless downpour transformed the already treacherous landscape into a nightmarish obstacle course. Mud clung to Garrett's boots like organic weights, each step requiring twice the effort of the last. Carrying Empress Nilara Zin'Vex, he navigated through the rain-slicked terrain with grim determination, his muscles screaming in protest against the prolonged exertion. "You should leave me," Nilara said, her voice barely audible above the hammering rain. Despite her weakened state, imperial pride colored her tone. "This is futile." "Not happening," Garrett replied through gritted teeth, adjusting his grip as he sidestepped a partially concealed sinkhole. "We started this together. We'll finish it together." Every few minutes, he paused briefly, using whatever meager shelter presented itself, a jutting rock formation, the hollow of a fallen synth steel structure, to catch his breath and check Nilara's condition. The nanite-infused bandages he'd applied earlier glowed faintly with bioluminescence as they worked to accelerate her healing, but the process was painfully slow. Her azure skin, normally vibrant with patterns of light, now pulsed erratically, reflecting her unstable vital signs. In the gathering darkness, these pulses of light served as their primary illumination, casting eerie blue shadows across the rain-washed landscape. Thunder rolled overhead, deep and threatening, while lightning periodically split the sky, momentarily painting everything in stark white brilliance. During these flashes, Garrett caught glimpses of movement at the periphery of his vision. Shadowy figures darting between distant rock formations, watching, following. Friend or foe remained impossible to determine. "We have company," he murmured, instinctively shifting to put his body between Nilara and the potential threat. "I see them," she replied, her opalescent eyes tracking the movement with surprising clarity despite her injuries. "Scavengers, perhaps. Or Vrekari scouts. Or your people," Garrett suggested, though without much conviction. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "My people made their choice when they abandoned their empress on the battlefield." The rain intensified, sheets of water reducing visibility to mere meters. Garrett pressed onward, his tactical mind evaluating and discarding options with practiced efficiency. They needed shelter, not just from the elements, but from whatever eyes tracked their progress through the storm. Nilara shivered against him, her body temperature fluctuating dangerously. The blue blood seeping through her bandages mixed with rainwater, creating ghostly patterns as it ran down her skin. Her breathing had grown more labored, each inhale a struggle against both injury and exhaustion. "Stay with me, Empress," Garrett urged, concern evident beneath his professional demeanor. "Focus on my voice." She made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or derision. It was impossible to tell, but she seemed to rally slightly, her eyes focusing with renewed determination. "There," she whispered suddenly, gesturing weakly toward what appeared to be a natural formation in the hillside ahead. "A cave system. My people used them during the first Vrekari incursion." Garrett altered course immediately, heading toward the indicated location. The cave entrance was well concealed, partially overgrown with native vegetation that had adapted to the harsh environment. Inside, the air was cooler but dry, the sound of rainfall diminished to a distant drumming. Using the illumination from his tactical wristband, Garrett examined their temporary sanctuary. The cave extended deeper than initially apparent, branching into multiple chambers. Ancient markings adorned the walls, not random scratches, but deliberate symbols reminiscent of those etched into Nilara's skin. "Your people have been here before," he observed, gently setting her down on a relatively flat surface. Nilara's gaze traced the symbols, recognition flickering across her features. "This was an outpost during the ancestral wars, long before the unification of the Azuran houses." Her voice carried a strange mixture of reverence and melancholy. "My progenitors sheltered here when the three moons aligned and brought the great storms." Garrett busied himself with practical matters, securing the entrance, checking their supplies, creating a small heat source that wouldn't attract attention. All the while, he kept his senses alert for any sign of their mysterious followers. "We should be safe here for a few hours," he said finally, kneeling beside Nilara to check her wounds. "Long enough for you to rest and for those nanites to do more of their work." As he carefully removed the saturated bandages to apply fresh ones, Nilara studied him with unexpected intensity. "You never told me your designation, Terran," she said. "Garrett," he replied, focused on cleaning a particularly nasty laceration. "Garrett Wolfe." "Not a military designation," she observed. "I haven't been military for a long time," he answered, his tone making it clear that the subject wasn't open for discussion. To his surprise, she didn't press further. Instead, she said, "I am Nilara Zin'Vex, 16th Empress of the Azuran Collective, sovereign of the tri-spiral systems, voice of the ancestral consciousness." A pause, then with bitter irony. "Or I was." Garrett met her gaze directly. "Titles are just words, Empress. They don't define what you are when everything else is stripped away." "And what am I without them, Garrett Wolfe?" she challenged, genuine uncertainty beneath her imperial manner. He considered her question seriously. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "That's something you'll have to discover. But I suspect there's more to you than ceremonial headdresses and fancy appellations." A tense silence followed, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the soft hiss of medical nanites activating on fresh bandages. When Nilara spoke again, her voice had lost some of its edge. "My people," she began, then corrected herself. "The Azurans were not always as you see us now. Before the collective, before the empire, we were nomadic. We followed the celestial migrations, lived in harmony with the cosmic cycles." Her eyes grew distant, recalling histories learned during her formative centuries. Then came the first contact with off-worlders. They brought technology beyond our understanding. Some saw opportunity, others saw threat. "Let me guess," Garrett interjected. "War followed." "Civil war," she confirmed grimly. Brother against sister, house against house. The traditionalists fought to preserve our ancient ways. The progressives embraced off-world knowledge, believing it was our destiny to expand beyond our home system. And your ancestors led the progressives, Garrett surmised. Nilara's lips curved in a slight smile. No, my progenitor, Vrekari Zin'Vex, was the greatest of the traditionalists. He fought viciously to preserve our isolation. Her expression grew complicated, until the day he witnessed his mate and offspring slaughtered by rival houses. That day he embraced the very technologies he had opposed, not for progress, but for vengeance. Garrett listened silently, understanding dawning in his eyes. The history of species across the galaxy showed remarkable similarities, cycles of violence, revenge, expansion, and eventual decay. He unified the houses through fear, Nilara continued, her voice hollow. Established the collective with himself as supreme ruler. Each successive emperor or empress followed his example, expanding our reach, demanding absolute obedience. She met Garrett's gaze directly. I was raised to believe this was strength, that compassion was weakness, that fear was the only reliable motivator. And now? Garrett prompted gently. Her opalescent eyes reflected the dim light like fractured moons. Now I lie wounded in a cave, abandoned by subjects who feared me, but never loved me, dependent on a Terran stranger who owes me nothing. A bitter laugh escaped her. Perhaps the universe has a sense of irony after all. Before Garrett could respond, a sound from the cave entrance snapped both of them to alertness. He moved swiftly, drawing his weapon and positioning himself between Nilara and the potential threat. Silhouettes appeared at the mouth of the cave, elongated, unmistakably azure forms, backlit by occasional lightning flashes. They carried weapons but held them at neutral positions, neither threatening nor entirely peaceful. Empress Zin'Vex called a melodic voice, speaking in the complex tonal language of the Azurans. We have tracked your biosignature through the storm. Nilara responded in the same language, her imperial authority somehow restored despite her prone position. The exchange continued for several moments, tension evident in every syllable. Finally, she switched to Galactic Standard for Garrett's benefit. They claim to be loyalists who became separated during the battle. They say they've been searching for survivors. Her tone made it clear she harbored doubts. And do you believe them? Garrett asked quietly, weapon still at the ready. Nilara's eyes narrowed as she studied the newcomers. Once I would have executed them for the mere suggestion that they lost their empress on the battlefield. She sighed, wincing at the pain the action caused. But perhaps that approach is what led us here in the first place? With visible effort, she addressed the Azuran group again. This human saved my life when my own guard fled. He is under my protection. Lower your weapons completely if you truly come as allies. A moment of hesitation, then the lead Azuran gave a command. Weapons were lowered, though not holstered, a compromise that acknowledged the fragile trust between the parties. They will escort us to their encampment, Nilara translated for Garrett. Apparently, some of our forces regrouped several kilometers from here. They have medical facilities. She paused, then added with unexpected vulnerability, I leave the decision to you. We can go with them or continue alone. Garrett assessed the situation with practiced efficiency. Nilara needed proper medical care beyond what his field equipment could provide. Yet trusting these Azurans meant potentially walking into a trap. Your call, Empress, he said finally. These are your people. Do you trust them? The question seemed to catch her off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked for her trust rather than demanding her command? When had she last been required to place faith in others rather than simply expecting obedience? I don't know, she admitted, the honesty costing her visibly. But I think I must learn to, if anything is to change. Garrett nodded, understanding the significance of her response. Then we go together. He holstered his weapon but kept it easily accessible. To the waiting Azurans, he said in Galactic Standard, lead the way, but know this. She doesn't leave my sight. The lead Azuran inclined his elongated head in acknowledgement. Two others approached with a stretcher fashioned from salvaged materials. With careful movements, they transferred Nilara onto it, their touches reverent despite her fallen status. As they prepared to depart, Garrett retrieved the crown of Azuran from where he had safely stowed it. For a moment he held the ornate headdress, studying its intricate construction. Crystal and metal woven together in patterns that seemed to capture light from sources he couldn't identify. "Your crown, Empress," he said, offering it to her. Nilara looked at the symbol of her authority, emotions warring across her features. Then, surprisingly, she shook her head. "Keep it safe for now," she said quietly. "I must earn the right to wear it again." As they emerged from the cave into the ongoing storm, the small party moved with purposeful efficiency. The shadowy figures that had tracked them earlier were nowhere to be seen, either deterred by the larger group or perhaps having been the same Azurans who now escorted them. The rain continued unabated, washing away blood, both blue and red, from a battlefield that represented the end of one chapter and perhaps the beginning of another. Between human and Azuran, between Empress and subject, tenuous connections were forming. Whether they would strengthen or shatter remained to be seen. The Azuran encampment sprawled across a sheltered valley, hidden from aerial surveillance by a combination of natural rock formations and advanced cloaking technology. What had once been an Imperial battalion had been reduced to perhaps 200 survivors, a fraction of their original strength, but more than Nilara had dared hope for. As their party approached, murmurs spread through the gathered Azurans. Many bowed reflexively at the sight of their Empress, centuries of conditioning overriding the unusual circumstances. Others stood frozen, uncertain how to react to their once invincible ruler, now carried on a makeshift stretcher, dependent on the aid of others, including a human. The senior medical officer, an elderly Azuran whose azure skin had faded to a pale cerulean with age, immediately took charge of Nilara's care. Garrett watched as they transferred her to their medical facility, a series of interconnected pods fashioned from salvaged parts of their battlecruisers. "You should let them examine you as well," Nilara said before they separated, her tone making it more command than suggestion. Garrett shook his head. "I'll be fine. Focus on healing." He hesitated, then added, "I won't go far." For a moment, something vulnerable flickered in her opalescent eyes. Fear, perhaps, that once out of sight, he would abandon her, as the others had. Then her imperial mask slid back into place, and she merely nodded before allowing the medical officers to take her inside. Left alone, Garrett became acutely aware of the scrutiny directed his way. The Azurans maintained a respectful distance, but their suspicious glances communicated volumes. He was an anomaly, a human in their midst, somehow connected to their Empress in ways they couldn't comprehend. A tall Azuran warrior approached, his ceremonial armor marking him as a high-ranking officer. Unlike most of his kind, who moved with fluid grace, this one's gait was stiff, favoring his right side, evidence of recent injury. "I am Commander Thalox," he announced in accented Galactic standard. "The scouts say you saved our Empress when others fled." His tone suggested skepticism rather than gratitude. "That's one interpretation," Garrett replied neutrally, assessing the commander with practiced caution. "Why would a human risk himself for an Azuran Empress?" Thalox demanded, cutting to the heart of his suspicion. "What do you seek to gain?" It was the same question Nilara had asked, though with considerably less diplomatic phrasing. Garrett considered giving the same answer, but something in the commander's posture, the defensiveness, the barely concealed shame, suggested a different approach was needed. "I was there," Garrett said simply. "When your forces retreated, when your Empress lay abandoned on the battlefield, I was there. Sometimes that's all it takes, being present when everyone else is gone." The barb struck home. Thalox's facial patterns pulsed with emotions Garrett couldn't fully interpret, but shame and anger were clearly among them. "You know nothing of our circumstances," the commander hissed. "The Vrekari unleashed weapons we had never encountered. Our shields failed. Our communications were jammed. Command structure collapsed. And yet here you are," Garrett observed calmly. "Regrouped, organized, apparently functional enough to send search parties." He leaned slightly closer. "But not for your Empress. Not until much later." Thalox's hand dropped to his ceremonial blade, fingers tightening around the hilt. For a moment, violence hung in the air between them, a single wrong word away from eruption. "Commander Thalox," called a melodic voice. Both men turned to see the elderly Azuran who had been treating Nilara. "The Empress requests the human's presence." The tension dissipated, replaced by something more complex. Thalox stepped aside, though his glare promised their conversation wasn't concluded. Inside the medical pod, advanced technology hummed with quiet efficiency. Nilara lay on a specialized diagnostic platform, surrounded by holographic displays showing her biological data. Her condition had visibly improved, the nanite treatments Garrett had applied having stabilized her enough for the Azuran physicians to begin more sophisticated interventions. "Leave us," she commanded the medical staff, who immediately complied, filing out of the pod with practiced efficiency. Once alone, Nilara's imperious expression softened slightly. "They tell me your field treatments saved my life," she said. "The nanite formulation you used was particularly effective on Azuran physiology." Garrett shrugged, uncomfortable with the implied gratitude. "Lucky coincidence. Those nanites are designed to adapt to various biology types." "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "or perhaps the universe has plans we cannot foresee." She gestured to a nearby seating platform. "You've made an impression on my remaining officers. Commander Thalok seems particularly stimulated by your presence." A wry smile twisted Garrett's lips. "We had a difference of opinion regarding battlefield priorities." "I imagine you did." Nilara's expression grew serious. "He was my most loyal commander, or so I believed. Yet even he retreated when the Vrekari deployed their quantum disruptors." She paused, studying Garrett with unnerving intensity. "You spoke of trust earlier, of inspiration rather than fear. I have been considering your words." Garrett remained silent, sensing she needed to work through her thoughts without interruption. "For centuries I ruled as I was taught, demanding absolute obedience, punishing failure, viewing compassion as weakness." Her opalescent eyes grew distant. "It seemed effective. The Azuran collective expanded. Our enemies trembled at the mention of our fleet." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Yet when true adversity arrived, all that fear, all that supposed loyalty, evaporated like morning mist." "Fear motivates people to survive," Garrett observed quietly, "but not to sacrifice." "Yes," Nilara nodded slowly. "I begin to understand the distinction." She shifted, wincing slightly as her healing wounds protested the movement. "My senior officers are gathering to discuss our situation. The Vrekari believe me dead, which grants us a momentary advantage. I would have you attend this council." Garrett blinked, genuinely surprised by the request. "I'm not one of your officers, Empress. I don't have military standing here." "Precisely," she replied, a hint of her former imperial authority returning. "You have no stake in our hierarchy, no position to protect, no face to save. You will speak truth when others might hesitate." She met his gaze directly. "Consider it repayment for saving my life if you require motivation." Put that way, Garrett found it difficult to refuse. "When does this council convene?" "When I arrive," she answered with the faintest trace of amusement. With visible effort, she began to rise from the diagnostic platform. Garrett moved to assist her, but a sharp glance stopped him. This, it seemed, was something she needed to do herself. A reclamation of dignity and strength before facing her officers. Her movements were pained but determined as she dressed in the ceremonial attire that had been prepared. Unlike her previous elaborate regalia, this was simple, functional, a commander's uniform rather than an empress's finery. She left the crown of Azuran aside, a decision Garrett noted with interest. Together they walked to the command center, Nilara setting a deliberate pace that concealed the worst of her lingering injuries. Azuran warriors they passed bowed deeply, expressions ranging from awe to uncertainty to barely concealed resentment. The command center had been established in the largest of the salvage pods. Inside, a dozen senior officers stood around a holographic display showing tactical data of the surrounding regions. Conversation ceased abruptly as Nilara entered, all eyes turning to her, and then with varying degrees of suspicion, to Garrett. "Empress," Commander Thalok acknowledged, bowing stiffly, "we had not expected you to join us so soon after your recovery." "Clearly," Nilara replied coolly, taking her position at the head of the tactical display. "Yet here I stand. The Empress of Azeron does not delegate when the future of her people hangs in the balance." The subtle emphasis on her continued authority wasn't lost on anyone present. A tense silence followed as she surveyed the gathered officers, her gaze lingering momentarily on each face as if committing their reactions to memory. "Report," she commanded finally. For the next hour, Garrett listened as the Azuran officers detailed their situation. The catastrophic defeat at Karvash Valley, the scattered survivors, the limited resources at their disposal, and the advancing Vrekari forces methodically securing the region. Their command structure operates from a central nexus, explained the intelligence officer, a slender Azuran with unusually patterned skin. Our scouts have identified it here. He indicated a fortress-like structure on the holographic display. It coordinates all Vrekari operations in this sector. Defenses? Nilara asked. Substantial, the officer replied grimly. Multiple perimeter layers, automated defense systems, approximately 500 troops. Against our 200 wounded warriors, commented Thalox, his tone bitter. A suicidal proposition, Empress. Nilara's expression remained impassive. And yet we must strike at this nexus or accept total defeat. Her gaze swept the room. I await your suggestions, commanders. What followed was a heated debate of increasingly desperate proposals. Some advocated hiding, rebuilding their strength over time. Others suggested seeking allies among other species with grievances against the Vrekari. A few extremists proposed sacrificial attacks designed to inflict maximum damage with no expectation of survival. Throughout, Garrett remained silent, observing the dynamics with an outsider's perspective. He noted which officers deferred to others, which ones spoke with conviction versus those who merely echoed popular sentiments. Most revealing was how they addressed Nilara, some with genuine respect, others with carefully veiled resentment, a few with fear so ingrained it had become second nature. Finally, Nilara turned to him. You have been uncharacteristically quiet, Garrett Wolfe. What perspective does the human offer? All eyes turned to him, most hostile or dismissive. Garrett straightened, meeting their stares calmly. You're thinking like an empire, he said bluntly, operating on assumptions that no longer apply. A murmur of indignation rippled through the officers. Thalox stepped forward, his posture aggressive. And how should we think, human? Should we abandon centuries of military doctrine on your advice? If that doctrine led to your current situation? Yes. Garrett moved to the holographic display, gesturing for permission to manipulate it. After a moment's hesitation, Nilara nodded. Garrett adjusted the display to show the surrounding terrain in greater detail. You're approaching this as a conventional military problem, matching your diminished forces against their superior ones. That's a losing equation. He highlighted several features of the landscape. But you're not an army anymore. You're survivors. That requires different tactics. Over the next several minutes, he outlined an approach that contradicted virtually every aspect of traditional Azuran military strategy. Instead of direct confrontation, he proposed a series of coordinated strikes using small teams. Rather than concentrating their forces, he suggested distributing them to create the impression of a larger, more widespread resistance. The Vrekari believe they've won, he concluded. Use that against them. Make them question that victory. Create uncertainty, confusion, the sense that they're fighting shadows rather than a conventional enemy. Guerrilla tactics, Nilara observed, surprising him with her familiarity with the term. Unorthodox for Azuran warfare. Which is precisely why they might work, Garrett argued. Your traditional approaches are known quantities to the Vrekari. They've prepared for them, countered them. This they won't expect. It lacks honor, objected one of the older officers, his facial patterns pulsing with disapproval. Honor won't matter if you're extinct, Garrett countered bluntly. A tense silence followed, broken finally by Nilara. The human speaks truth we find uncomfortable, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Our empire stands on the brink of annihilation. Conventional warfare failed us at Karvash Valley. Perhaps unconventional methods will succeed where tradition has not. She gestured to the tactical display. Commander Thalox, select your best scouts for reconnaissance of these locations. Intelligence Officer Morale, assess our remaining weapons and equipment for compatibility with these proposed tactics. Her gaze swept the room. We move forward with this approach. Dismissed. As the officers filed out, many casting dubious glances at Garrett, Nilara remained by the tactical display, studying it with intense concentration. When they were alone, she spoke without looking up. You have upended centuries of Azuran military doctrine in a single council session, she observed, a hint of ironic amusement in her tone. Not since the Third Dynasty has our approach to warfare been so fundamentally questioned. Garrett shrugged. Desperate times. Indeed. She finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Tell me, Garrett Wolfe, was this truly improvised strategy, or have you been planning this since you found me on the battlefield? The question carried weight beyond its surface meaning. It probed at trust, at intentions, at the strange alliance that had formed between them. I've been in enough losing wars to recognize the patterns, he answered honestly. When conventional approaches fail, when you're outgunned and outnumbered, you adapt or you die. It's not complex philosophy, just survival. Nilara studied him for a long moment, as if seeing beyond his words to the experiences that had shaped them. You speak from personal loss, she said finally, from battles that left scars deeper than those visible on your skin. Garrett didn't confirm or deny her assessment. Some wounds weren't meant for discussion, especially with someone he'd known for such a brief time. Seeming to understand his silence, Nilara changed direction. The council accepted my decision, but make no mistake, many doubt. They follow because I am Empress, because centuries of conditioning demand their obedience. A bitter smile touched her lips. The very culture of fear you criticize now serves a purpose, however temporary. It's bought time, Garrett acknowledged, but fear won't sustain them through what's coming. They'll need something more. Yes. Nilara's opalescent eyes held a new resolve. They will need to believe, not in my divine right to rule, but in their own capacity to prevail against impossible odds. She straightened, decision made. We begin immediately. The Vrekari Nexus must be our primary target, but we'll need intelligence, resources, possibly allies. One step at a time, Empress, Garrett cautioned. Your people need to adjust to this new approach. Too much change too quickly and the whole structure collapses. She acknowledged his point with a slight inclination of her head. Then we will learn together, my officers to fight as insurgents rather than imperial warriors, and she paused, seeming to search for words unfamiliar to her vocabulary. I must learn to lead rather than simply rule. As they left the command center together, Garrett noticed subtle changes in how the Azurans responded to their Empress. The bows remained, the formal acknowledgments continued, but something had shifted. Eyes lingered longer, expressions registered curiosity rather than merely fear or resignation. Word of the council's decisions had spread quickly, it seemed, and with it a tentative, fragile thing that might, given time, grow into hope. Whether that hope would be justified remained to be seen. The path ahead would demand sacrifices, innovations, and a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to be Azuran in a universe where their empire no longer dominated. For Nilara Zin'Vex, 16th Empress of a crumbling dynasty, the greatest challenge would not be defeating the Vrekari. It would be transforming herself and her people into something that could survive in a changed reality. As if reading his thoughts, Nilara spoke quietly. When this began, I sought only to reclaim what was lost, my throne, my empire, my dominion. Now I question whether those things in their previous forms deserve to be restored. It was perhaps the most revolutionary statement Garrett had heard from her, an admission that transcended battlefield tactics to touch on something more fundamental, the purpose of leadership itself. Some things need to break before they can become something better, he offered, the philosophy born from his own painful experiences. Nilara considered his words, their truth resonating with her newly awakened perspective. Then let us see what emerges from these broken pieces, she said finally. Something new, something perhaps worth fighting for. In the days that followed, the encampment transformed from a refuge of defeated survivors into a base of operations for what Thalox reluctantly termed the insurgency. Small teams ventured out on missions of increasing complexity and daring, gathering intelligence, sabotaging Vrekari supply lines, establishing contact with other pockets of Azuran resistance scattered across the region. Garrett found himself at the center of this transformation, his experience in unconventional warfare proving invaluable. He trained Azuran warriors in techniques they had previously considered beneath their dignity: stealth approaches, hit-and-run attacks, psychological warfare designed to create the impression of a much larger resistance force. Most surprising was Nilara's direct involvement. Rather than commanding from a position of remote authority, she participated in planning sessions, learned the techniques alongside her warriors, and even accompanied a reconnaissance mission to observe Vrekari patterns firsthand. Though her injuries had not fully healed, her determination never wavered. In the process, something unprecedented began to emerge, a relationship between Empress and subjects based on mutual respect rather than fear and obligation. Warriors who had once obeyed out of conditioning now followed out of growing conviction. Ideas were offered freely, innovations suggested without fear of punishment for overstepping. For Garrett, watching this evolution stirred complicated emotions. He had seen enough conflicts to recognize the patterns forming, the forging of bonds through shared hardship, the emergence of genuine loyalty born from respect rather than coercion. He had experienced such connections before, had lost them to betrayal or death, or the grinding machinery of wars fought for reasons that eventually seemed meaningless. Maintaining emotional distance had become second nature, a survival mechanism as essential as breathing. Yet something about this situation, about Nilara's transformation in her people's response, made complete detachment impossible. One evening, as they reviewed intelligence gathered from their latest mission, Nilara noticed his unusual silence. "Your thoughts are elsewhere, Garrett Wolfe," she observed, using his full name as she often did, as if the formality provided necessary distance. "Something troubles you." He considered deflecting, but opted for partial honesty. "Progress has been faster than I expected. Your people have adapted well." "But," she prompted, her perceptiveness having sharpened during their time together. Garrett sighed, setting aside the tactical display they'd been studying. "But success brings escalation. The Vrekari are adjusting their strategies, deploying more resources to counter our activities. They're no longer treating this as a simple cleanup operation. They recognize the threat." "Is that not what we intended?" Nilara asked, though her tone suggested she already understood his concern. "It means they'll bring heavier assets into play." Garrett met her gaze directly. "The next phase will be bloodier. We'll lose people. The victories so far have been relatively clean. That won't continue." Nilara was silent for a moment, absorbing the implications. "You fear my people will revert to their old patterns when faced with significant losses. That in the crucible of true adversity, this fragile new approach will shatter." "It's a possibility," he acknowledged. She surprised him with a question that probed deeper than tactics. "And what of you, Garrett? What will you do when the losses mount? When Azuran warriors you've trained fall in battle? Will you maintain this alliance? Or will you determine that your debt is paid and seek safer harbors?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. She was asking about loyalty, about commitment beyond the exigencies that had thrown them together. It was territory he had carefully avoided, maintaining the fiction that his involvement was temporary, practical, without deeper significance. "I don't abandon missions halfway through," he said finally, deliberately keeping his response focused on the tactical rather than the personal. Nilara studied him with those unsettling opalescent eyes that seemed to perceive more than he intended to reveal. "No," she said softly, "I don't believe you do." She straightened, imperial dignity settling around her like a cloak. "Tomorrow we begin planning the operation against the Vrekari Nexus. All our previous activities have been building toward this objective. Success would change the balance of this conflict significantly." "And failure?" Garrett asked, though he already knew the answer. "Would likely mean the end of organized Azuran resistance in this sector," she replied without flinching. "The stakes are absolute, as they have always been." As she turned to leave, she paused at the entrance to the tactical center. "Whatever comes, Garrett Wolfe, know that you have already altered the course of Azuran history. Whether that alteration leads to salvation or merely a more dignified extinction remains to be seen, but it will not be forgotten." With those words, she departed, leaving Garrett alone with the tactical displays and his troubling thoughts. Her statement carried the weight of legacy, of actions that transcended immediate survival to touch on something more enduring. It was precisely the kind of thinking he had trained himself to avoid, focusing on the mission at hand, the immediate objective, rather than nebulous concepts like historical impact or lasting change. Yet as he reviewed the intelligence they'd gathered on the Vrekari Nexus, Calculating probabilities and planning approaches, he couldn't entirely dismiss the implications of her words. Somehow, against all his carefully maintained emotional barriers, he had become invested in more than just tactical success. He cared about what happened to these people, to her, beyond the immediate conflict. That realization was both unwelcome and undeniable. It complicated everything. The Vrekari command nexus loomed against the horizon, its architecture a testament to brutal efficiency. Unlike the flowing, organic structures favored by the Azurans, the fortress appeared to have been carved from a single massive block of dark material that absorbed light rather than reflected it. Sensor arrays and weapons platforms protruded at strategic intervals, while energy fields created shimmering barriers around the most critical sections. From their observation point several kilometers distant, Garrett studied the facility through enhanced optics, methodically cataloging defenses and potential vulnerabilities. Beside him, Nilara and Commander Thalox did the same, their expressions equally grim. Their patrol patterns have changed, Thalox noted, highlighting a section of the perimeter. Response times are shorter. They're anticipating infiltration attempts. Expected, Garrett replied, adjusting his focus to examine a secondary entrance partially concealed by topographical features. Our activities over the past weeks have put them on alert. They know someone's out here. They just don't know it's you. He glanced at Nilara. The belief that the Empress of Azeron died at Karvosh Valley remains our greatest advantage. Nilara nodded, her opalescent eyes reflecting the distant fortress. An advantage we must leverage precisely. She turned to Thalox. Are the teams prepared? As much as possible given the constraints, the commander answered, his earlier hostility toward their guerrilla approach having mellowed into grudging acceptance. Though I maintain that dividing our forces further reduces our already limited strength. Conventional thinking, Garrett countered, not unkindly, multiple smaller teams create multiple problems for the enemy to solve simultaneously. They can't concentrate their response if attacks come from different vectors. Thalox still appeared dubious, but deferred to Nilara's authority. The teams are ready, Empress. We await only your command. Nilara studied the fortress for a moment longer, her expression revealing nothing of her inner thoughts. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet certainty that had increasingly replaced her former imperial pronouncements. We proceed as planned. Communications discipline is absolute, quantum encryption protocols only, and minimal transmission duration. Her gaze shifted to include both males. If any team is compromised, they continue their assigned objective rather than attempting rescue operations. The Nexus is the priority. Understood, Thalox acknowledged, though the slight tension in his elongated frame suggested he found the order difficult to accept. The Azuran military culture had traditionally emphasized leaving no warrior behind, another aspect of their approach that Nilara had been forced to reconsider. As Thalox moved away to relay final instructions to the team leaders, Nilara turned to Garrett. You will coordinate from the secondary command post, she stated, her tone making it clear this was a decision already made. Garrett frowned. My place is with the primary infiltration team, he countered. I have the most experience with this type of operation. Precisely why you must remain in coordination position, she replied evenly. Your tactical oversight is more valuable than your presence on any single team. He studied her face, recognizing the strategy behind her words but suspecting an additional motive. And if something happens to you, if the primary team is compromised, her expression softened slightly, confirming his suspicion. Then someone with both the knowledge and the authority to continue must remain. Someone the warriors will follow even if their empress falls. She held his gaze steadily. They trust you, Garrett. Not all, not completely, but enough. That trust may prove crucial if events turn against us. The implication was clear. She was designating him as her contingency, ensuring the mission would continue regardless of her survival. It was both a pragmatic decision and a profound statement of trust that transcended their different species and histories. I still don't like it, he muttered, though he recognized the logic of her position. A rare smile briefly illuminated her features. Your preferences have been noted, Garrett Wolfe. My decision stands. Before he could formulate a response, Thalox returned, accompanied by the leaders of the various strike teams. Final coordinates were distributed, timing synchronized, contingencies reviewed one last time. Throughout, Nilara maintained the controlled confidence that had become her hallmark during their weeks of preparation. Neither the distant imperial figure she had once been, nor an overly familiar comrade, but a leader who commanded respect through competence rather than fear. As the meeting concluded and the warriors dispersed to their assigned positions, Nilara held Garrett back with a slight gesture. When they were alone, she removed a small device from her tactical harness and presented it to him. "What's this?" he asked, examining the crystalline object that pulsed with faint bioluminescence. "A quantum-linked communicator," she explained, "paired specifically to my neural patterns. If circumstances prevent my direct communication, my final thoughts will transfer to this device." Garrett stared at the crystal, suddenly uncomfortable with its implications. Nilara, it was perhaps the first time he had addressed her simply by name, without title or formality. The significance wasn't lost on either of them. "A precaution only," she assured him, her tone softening. "One I do not anticipate needing." He accepted the device reluctantly, securing it in his own equipment harness. "Make sure it stays that way," he said gruffly. "I've put too much effort into keeping you alive to have you throw it away on some heroic last stand." Her expression grew serious again. "If sacrifice becomes necessary, I will not hesitate. The mission is the priority," he finished for her. "I know. Just be careful." The words felt inadequate, laden with sentiments he wasn't prepared to articulate even to himself. She inclined her head slightly, acknowledgement and promise combined. "Until we reunite, Garrett Wolfe." With that, she turned and moved with fluid grace to join her strike team, her azure skin catching the faint light of Azuron's triple moons as they emerged from behind cloud cover. He watched until she disappeared from view, then made his way to the secondary command post, where he would coordinate the complex operation. The attack began precisely as planned. Multiple strike teams approaching the Vrekari nexus from different directions, under cover of both technology and terrain. From his position at the command post, Garrett monitored their progress through encrypted communications and remote sensor feeds, providing real-time adjustments as the situation evolved. The initial phases proceeded with remarkable success. Perimeter defenses were neutralized with minimal detection, creating openings for the main infiltration teams. Diversionary attacks drew Vrekari forces away from critical areas, thinning their response capabilities exactly as predicted. Nilara's team, targeting the central control systems, penetrated deeper than any other, exploiting vulnerabilities the reconnaissance missions had identified. Through the quantum encrypted channel, her voice remained calm and focused as she reported their progress. "Primary objective in sight," she transmitted. "Minimal resistance encountered. Proceeding to final approach." Garrett acknowledged, simultaneously tracking the other team's activities. Something felt wrong. The operation was proceeding too smoothly. The Vrekari responses too predictable. Years of combat experience had taught him to distrust apparent success when it came too easily. "All teams, heightened alert status," he transmitted. "Possible counter-ambush scenario developing." Confirmation signals returned from most teams, but Nilara's channel remained silent. Garrett checked the sensor feeds, finding their signatures still active, but in a static position. "Empress, acknowledge heightened alert status," he transmitted again, protocol momentarily forgotten in his growing concern. The response, when it came, wasn't from Nilara, but from Thalox, who had been assigned to a different team. "Command, be advised. Central security systems showing unusual activity patterns. Possible trap detection." Before Garrett could process this information, alarms erupted across the monitoring systems. Throughout the Vrekari nexus, containment fields activated simultaneously, compartmentalizing sections of the fortress and isolating the infiltration teams from each other and their extraction routes. "All teams, abort mission," Garrett transmitted immediately. "Fall back to secondary extraction points. Priority is personnel recovery, not objective completion." Most teams acknowledged, already implementing their emergency withdrawal procedures. Nilara's team remained silent. Garrett focused all available sensors on their last known position, searching for any indication of their status. The readings were confusing. Life signs present but erratic, movement patterns suggesting conflict, energy signatures inconsistent with standard Vrekari weapons. Making a split-second decision, he transmitted to the remaining field commander, "I'm moving to support the primary team. Maintain coordination of all other teams' extraction." Without waiting for acknowledgement, he grabbed his tactical gear and exited the command post, heading toward the fortress at a full run. Protocol dictated maintaining command position, but protocol hadn't accounted for Nilara's team facing whatever anomaly the sensors had detected. As he approached the fortress, the situation deteriorated further. Explosions rocked the northern quadrant, creating chaos that benefited some extraction teams while complicating others. Through his comm link, he heard fragmented reports of unexpected Vrekari reinforcements, of weapons unlike any previously encountered. Reaching the primary team's entry point, Garrett found signs of conflict, azuran blood on the access panels, discarded equipment, blast marks from energy weapons. Following their planned route, he moved deeper into the fortress, every sense heightened for danger. The quantum-linked communicator Nilara had given him pulsed suddenly, growing warm against his chest. Seeking momentary cover, he withdrew it, finding its crystalline structure now glowing intensely, patterns shifting across its surface in what appeared to be Azuran script. Before he could decipher its meaning, movement ahead caught his attention. A figure stumbled around the corner, an Azuran warrior from Nilara's team, severely wounded but still moving. Garrett rushed forward, catching the warrior before they collapsed. "The Empress!" the warrior gasped, recognizing Garrett despite their pain. "Trap! Knew we were coming! New weapon!" "Where?" Garrett demanded, administering emergency medical nanites from his kit. The warrior gestured weakly down the corridor. "Central chamber. They wanted her alive, knew who she was." This changed everything. If the Vrekari had somehow identified Nilara, if they had specifically targeted her, rather than simply responding to an infiltration. "How many guards?" Garrett asked, already calculating options. "Many, but new weapon is worse." The warrior's strength was failing despite the nanite's efforts. "Energy field. Disrupts our neural patterns." "Agony." Garrett's jaw tightened. Weapons designed specifically to target Azuran biology suggested a level of preparation beyond what they had anticipated. It implied intelligence gathering, research, development, all focused on countering the specific threat Nilara represented. "Rest," he told the wounded warrior, administering a stabilizing agent. "Extraction team will find you. I'm going after her." As he moved deeper into the fortress, evidence of the battle became more pronounced. Bodies, both Azuran and Vrekari, littered the corridors. The air hummed with an unfamiliar energy that made his teeth ache and his skin crawl. Whatever this new weapon was, it affected humans as well, though perhaps not as severely as Azurans. The quantum communicator continued to pulse, its glow intensifying as he approached what he presumed was the central chamber. The Azuran script flowing across its surface had stabilized into a repeating pattern, a message or warning, though he couldn't interpret it. Ahead, voices echoed, the harsh, guttural language of the Vrekari, punctuated by a sound that turned his blood cold. Nilara's voice, normally controlled and imperial, distorted into a cry of pure agony. Caution gave way to urgency. Drawing his weapons, Garrett moved swiftly toward the sound, pausing only to assess the chamber's layout through a narrow access panel. The central chamber was vast, dominated by a raised platform where a complex array of technology pulsed with malevolent energy. Surrounding it were at least a dozen Vrekari soldiers, their massive forms encased in battle armor that reflected the chamber's harsh lighting. In the center of the platform, suspended within a shimmering energy field, was Nilara. Her azure skin had paled to an ashen blue, her elegant limbs contorted in pain as waves of focused energy washed over her. Despite her obvious suffering, her expression remained defiant, her opalescent eyes burning with hatred as she glared at the Vrekari commander who stood before her. "Your insurgency ends here, Empress Zin'Vex," the commander was saying, his voice translated through a mechanical device at his throat. "Your capture will demoralize the remaining Azuran resistance. They will surrender when they learn their ruler begged for mercy." "I do not beg," Nilara spat, each word clearly costing her tremendous effort. "Nor will my people surrender to butchers and thieves." The Vrekari commander laughed, a harsh sound like stones grinding together. Brave words from one who failed her empire so completely, Your people abandoned you once. They will do so again. As if to emphasize his point, he gestured to a control panel. The energy field intensified, ringing another cry of pain from Nilara, despite her obvious attempt to remain silent. Garrett had seen enough. Subtlety was no longer an option. Direct intervention was required, regardless of the odds. Quickly, he assessed the chamber's vulnerabilities: power conduits, structural supports, the positioning of the Vrekari soldiers. The quantum communicator at his chest had grown almost painfully hot, its glow now visible even through the fabric of his tactical gear. Removing it, he found the Azuran script had formed a specific pattern, one he had seen before in Nilara's tactical displays. It was a detonation sequence. Understanding dawned with crystal clarity. The communicator wasn't just a communication device, it was a quantum-linked explosive, capable of disrupting the specific energy frequencies the Vrekari were using to torture Nilara. She had anticipated this possibility, had prepared for it with characteristic thoroughness. Activating the sequence would create a localized quantum disruption that would likely disable the energy field holding her. It would also, he realized grimly, cause significant damage to anyone within its radius, including Nilara herself. It was both weapon and last resort. A final act of defiance should capture become inevitable. Garrett made his decision, setting the communicator to its maximum disruptive potential but minimum explosive force. He created a different kind of strategy. Withdrawing one of his own specialized weapons, a sonic disruptor designed to overwhelm sensitive audio receptors, he calibrated it to the Vrekari's known physiological vulnerabilities. Then, with careful aim, he threw the quantum communicator through the access panel directly at the main power conduit, feeding the energy field that held Nilara. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The quantum disruption collided with the energy field's containment systems, creating a cascade failure that spread through the connected systems. Alarms blared as emergency protocols activated, further adding to the chaos. In the crucial moments of confusion, Garrett activated the sonic disruptor and entered the chamber, its debilitating frequencies causing the Vrekari soldiers to stagger and clutch at their audio receptors. Taking advantage of their disorientation, he moved with lethal efficiency, neutralizing the closest threats with precision strikes. The energy field containing Nilara flickered and failed, dropping her unceremoniously to the platform. Despite her weakened state, she recovered with remarkable speed, immediately assessing the situation and moving to capitalize on the advantage Garrett had created. Together, they fought their way through the disoriented Vrekari forces, each anticipating the other's movements with an synchronicity born from weeks of training together. Nilara, despite her torture, moved with deadly grace, her knowledge of Vrekari physiology allowing her to target vulnerable points with devastating effectiveness. The Vrekari commander, recovering faster than his subordinates, roared commands in his guttural language. Reinforcements began pouring into the chamber from adjacent sections of the fortress, threatening to overwhelm them through sheer numbers. "The control systems!" Nilara shouted over the cacophony of battle, gesturing toward a secondary console. "If we can access them, we can trigger the fortress's automated defense protocols." Understanding her intent immediately, Garrett provided covering fire while Nilara moved to the console. Her elongated fingers danced across the alien interface with surprising familiarity. "Vrekari systems are based on technology they stole from us centuries ago," she explained, never pausing in her work. "The underlying architecture remains similar enough to—" The console erupted in a shower of sparks as the Vrekari commander fired directly at it, missing Nilara by millimeters. Garrett returned fire, forcing the commander to seek cover. "Plan B," Nilara announced, pulling a small device from her tactical harness. "Remote detonation of the charges my team placed before we were discovered." "That'll bring the entire fortress down on us," Garrett protested, dispatching another Vrekari soldier who ventured too close. Her opalescent eyes met his, a familiar determination burning within them. "Do you have a better suggestion?" He didn't, and they both knew it. Their extraction window was rapidly closing as more Vrekari forces converged on their position. The mission objectives had evolved from data retrieval to simple survival, and denying the enemy their captured technology and intelligence in the process. "Do it," he confirmed, already calculating their escape route through the chaos that would follow. Nilara activated the device. Throughout the fortress, strategically placed explosives detonated simultaneously, targeting critical structural supports and power systems. The results were immediate and devastating. Sections of the fortress began to collapse, power fluctuated wildly, and automated systems initiated emergency protocols that further complicated the Vrekari response. Taking advantage of the confusion, Garrett and Nilara fought their way toward an emergency egress point identified during their earlier planning. The path was treacherous, blocked in places by debris and defended by increasingly desperate Vrekari soldiers. But their combined determination proved sufficient to overcome each obstacle. As they neared the exit, a final challenge awaited. The Vrekari commander, seemingly anticipating their route, stood blocking their path. Unlike his subordinates, he showed no signs of panic or disorientation. His massive form, encased in armor that dwarfed even the largest of his soldiers, radiated both power and rage. "You will not escape, Empress Zin'Vex," he growled, his translation device giving his words an artificial flatness that somehow made them more menacing. "Your resistance ends here, along with your human ally." Nilara straightened, her imperial dignity asserting itself despite her injuries and exhaustion. "You speak of endings, Commander Vreknar, yet fail to recognize your own. The Azuran Collective has withstood greater threats than you. We will endure long after your dominion crumbles to dust." The use of his name seemed to surprise the commander momentarily, a tactical advantage Garrett and Nilara exploited without hesitation. Moving in perfect coordination, they attacked from different angles, forcing the massive Vrekari to divide his attention. The battle was brief but intense, both sides fighting with the desperation of those who recognized the encounter's significance. Vreknar's superior strength and armor gave him advantages, but Garrett and Nilara's synchronized tactics gradually overwhelmed his defenses. A critical moment came when Nilara, feinting to draw the commander's attention, created an opening that Garrett exploited to target a vulnerable connection in the Vrekari's armor. The resulting damage disrupted the power systems that enhanced his strength, momentarily staggering him. In that crucial instant, Nilara struck with precise lethality, her weapon finding the narrow gap between helmet and torso armor. The commander collapsed, his massive form blocking the corridor, but no longer presenting an active threat. Wasting no time on celebration, they continued toward the exit, now moving with increased urgency as the fortress's destruction accelerated around them. Support beams groaned under structural stress, power conduits exploded in cascading failures, and the very floor beneath them began to tilt as foundational elements gave way. They emerged from the fortress minutes before its catastrophic collapse, the ground trembling beneath their feet as they put distance between themselves and the imploding structure. Behind them, the Vrekari Nexus, the command center that had coordinated the conquest of this sector, disappeared in a maelstrom of energy discharges and structural failure. Only when they had reached the relative safety of elevated terrain did they pause, turning to witness the complete destruction of their objective. The fortress, once an imposing symbol of Vrekari Dominion, was reduced to a smoking crater, occasional secondary explosions still erupting from its ruins. "It is done," Nilara said quietly, satisfaction and exhaustion mingling in her voice. "The Vrekari war machine in this sector has been decapitated. Their forces will fall into disarray without central coordination." Garrett nodded, performing a quick assessment of their respective injuries. Both had sustained damage during their escape, though nothing immediately life-threatening thanks to the medical nanites integrated into their tactical gear. "We need to rendezvous with the extraction teams," he said, already checking their communications equipment for functionality. "The other strike forces should be regrouping at the designated points." Nilara agreed, though her attention remained partly focused on the destroyed fortress. Something in her expression suggested she was seeing beyond the immediate tactical victory to its broader implications. "This changes the equation," she observed, "not just militarily, but philosophically. My people witnessed their empress fighting alongside them rather than commanding from safety. They saw what can be accomplished through cooperation rather than mere obedience." Her opalescent eyes shifted to meet his. "You have altered more than our tactics, Garrett Wolfe. You have catalyzed a transformation in how we perceive ourselves." The weight of her words made him uncomfortable, as acknowledgments of impact often did. "You did the transforming," he countered. I just provided some different perspectives. A slight smile touched her lips, softening her imperial features. False modesty does not become you. The smile faded, replaced by something more solemn. When we return to the encampment, decisions must be made regarding our path forward. The Vrekari will retaliate once they recover from this blow. We must be prepared. As they made their way toward the extraction point, communication was re-established with the surviving strike teams. Reports filtered in. Casualties had been sustained, but overall success had exceeded expectations. The Vrekari Nexus was destroyed, and with it their ability to coordinate large-scale operations in the immediate future. More surprising were the reports from other sectors. Apparently, news of the Azuran resistance had spread, inspiring similar uprisings across territories the Vrekari had considered secured. What had begun as a desperate last stand by a defeated empress and her remaining loyal subjects had evolved into something approaching a coordinated insurrection. When they finally reached the extraction point, they found more than just the strike teams awaiting them. Additional Azuran forces had arrived, warriors who had been scattered during the defeat at Karvash Valley, civilians who had taken up arms, even representatives from allied species who had suffered under Vrekari expansion. The reception they received was unlike anything Nilara had experienced in her centuries of rule. Where once her subjects had bowed in fearful respect, now they greeted her with genuine admiration, tinged with something new. Hope. They had witnessed her willingness to fight alongside them, to risk herself for their collective survival, and it had transformed their perception of her from distant ruler to true leader. Garrett observed this transformation with mixed emotions. Part of him, the professional soldier, the tactical advisor, felt satisfaction at the mission's success and its broader strategic implications. Another part, one he had tried to keep carefully compartmentalized, recognized that his involvement with Nilara and her people had evolved beyond professional parameters. He had become invested in their struggle, in their transformation, in the possibility they represented of something better emerging from the ashes of conflict. It was a dangerous emotional entanglement for someone who had survived by maintaining distance, by treating each mission as temporary, each alliance as conditional. As they returned to the main encampment, which had grown substantially during their absence, the full scope of what they had accomplished began to materialize. The destruction of the Vrekari Nexus had created a power vacuum that multiple factions were scrambling to fill. In that confusion lay opportunity, not just for military advantage, but for diplomatic initiatives, for coalition building, for reimagining what the Azuran collective could become in a changed galactic landscape. Nilara, sensing the potential of this moment, convened a council unlike any in Azuran history. Where once only high-ranking military officers and noble houses would have been permitted to speak, now representatives from every segment of their surviving society were invited to contribute. Warriors and civilians, traditionalists and progressives, even non-Azuran allies who had joined their cause. Garrett found himself included in this council, seated at Nilara's right hand, a position of honor that made many traditionalists uncomfortable, but symbolized the new approach she was embracing. Throughout the discussions, she sought his perspective, valuing his outsider's viewpoint and his experience with conflicts across multiple star systems. The Vrekari believed they had defeated us at Karvash Valley. Nilara addressed the assembled representatives, her voice carrying the authority of both traditional rule and newly earned respect. They thought the Azuran collective would crumble with the fall of its empress and the destruction of its main fleet. Her opalescent eyes swept the gathering. Instead, we have demonstrated that the Azuran spirit cannot be conquered through conventional warfare. Our strength lies not in our technology or our numbers, but in our adaptability, our resilience, and our unity of purpose. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly, strongest among those who had participated in the guerrilla campaign against the Vrekari. Even former skeptics like Commander Thalox now nodded in acknowledgement of the truth in her words. Moving forward, Nilara continued, we must expand upon what we have learned. The old Azuran collective, ruled through fear and rigid hierarchy, would not have survived this crisis. The new collective must be founded on different principles: mutual respect, shared responsibility, and the recognition that true strength comes from diversity of thought rather than enforced uniformity. For some of the older Azurans, This represented a radical departure from centuries of tradition. Objections were raised, concerns voiced about abandoning the practices that had built their empire in the first place. Nilara listened to each perspective with genuine attention, neither dismissing traditional viewpoints nor allowing them to override the clear lessons of recent events. Throughout the council, Garrett remained largely silent, offering input when directly asked, but recognizing that this was a pivotal moment in Azuran culture that they needed to navigate primarily on their own terms. His role was shifting from tactical advisor to something more nuanced, witness and occasional guide to a transformation that would ultimately be of their own making. As the council concluded its initial session, having established working parameters for their continuing resistance against the Vrekari, Nilara requested a private moment with Garrett. They walked together to a vantage point overlooking the expanded encampment, now resembling a small city more than a military outpost. "You were uncharacteristically quiet during the council," she observed, her tone curious rather than accusatory. "It wasn't my place to dominate that conversation," he replied honestly. "What you're doing, reimagining your entire society while simultaneously fighting for its survival, that's something your people need to shape collectively." She studied him with those penetrating opalescent eyes. "Yet your influence is undeniable. The tactics you introduced, the perspectives you shared, they have altered our course irrevocably. For better or worse," he acknowledged with a slight shrug. "For better," she stated firmly, "though perhaps not without cost." Her gaze shifted to the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to illuminate the landscape. The Azuran collective as it existed for 9 centuries is gone. What replaces it will be different, more adaptive, more inclusive, perhaps less dominating in its approach to other species. Some will view this as decline rather than evolution. "Change always faces resistance," Garrett observed, "especially when it challenges ideas people have built their identities around." "Indeed," Nilara turned to face him directly, "which brings me to a matter of some delicacy. Your role in our continued struggle." Garrett had been anticipating this conversation, though perhaps not so soon after their victory. With the immediate crisis addressed, the question of his continued presence among the Azurans naturally arose. "You're wondering if I'm planning to leave," he surmised. "The thought has occurred," she admitted. "Your initial involvement was circumstantial, a chance encounter on a battlefield, a decision made in the moment. No formal allegiance binds you to our cause." Beneath her carefully neutral tone, he detected something more personal, a concern that transcended strategic considerations to touch on the connection that had formed between them during their shared trials. "What would you prefer?" he asked, wanting her to articulate her position before revealing his own thoughts. Nilara straightened, imperial dignity briefly reasserting itself. Then, visibly making a decision, she allowed that facade to soften. "I would prefer you remain," she said simply. "Not merely as tactical advisor, though your expertise in that regard remains invaluable, but as—" she hesitated, seemingly searching for the right term. "As partner in this transformation we have begun. Few understand as you do both what we were and what we might become." The word partner carried implications that neither of them fully addressed, an acknowledgement of a relationship that had evolved beyond professional parameters into something more complex and significant. Garrett considered her words carefully. The professional soldier in him recognized that the Azuran conflict was far from resolved. The Vrekari would recover, would adapt their strategies, would seek vengeance for the destruction of their nexus. From a purely tactical perspective, the challenges ahead would be fascinating. The opportunities to further develop guerrilla methodologies against a superior conventional force compelling. But it was not tactics alone that influenced his decision. "I'll stay," he said finally, "at least until we've dealt with the Vrekari counteroffensive that's inevitably coming. After that," he left the future deliberately open-ended. "One battle at a time, Empress." Relief flickered briefly across her features before her composure reasserted itself. "A wise approach," she agreed. "And please, when we speak privately, Nilara will suffice." It was a small gesture but significant, an offering of personal connection beyond their formal roles. Garrett acknowledged it with a nod. "Nilara, then," he said, testing the intimacy of using her name without title or formal address. As the sun rose fully over the horizon, illuminating the landscape in hues of amber and gold. They stood together in comfortable silence. The human soldier and the alien empress, united by circumstance and choice, facing an uncertain future with shared purpose and growing mutual respect.